Oh yeah, it's time to soup this thing up. Hey, there's my stickers. Beyond excited to make a return to PlayStation 3 emulation using the excellent RPCS3 emulator, and last year I took a deep dive using RPCS3 with the ROG Ally, which ended up being quite useful for more than just Ally owners, since we've seen other Z1 Extreme handhelds as well as the 7840U and more recently 8840U devices, which all benefited from the research done last year. I knew that when the Ally X was announced that I would be making an updated video to the work done last year so that we could check in more than a year later and see how things have improved and where they stand today with RPCS3 and PlayStation 3 emulation. My goal for this video was to make it bigger, better, and as comprehensive as possible so that more can enjoy the magic of the RPCS3 emulator and the PlayStation 3 in general. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we yet again explore RPCS3 and go over everything you need to get started and check out an enormous 100 games for the PlayStation 3. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment to thank the RPCS3 team for their tremendous work, and without RPCS3, none of this would be possible. RPCS3 does have a Patreon page, and you can directly support them there, which I will have linked down in the description. I did want to briefly mention that my prior video on RPCS3 will still be useful for games that I didn't cover this time around in this showcase. Not only that, but I also did a video comparing console exclusives for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 with Xenia Canary and RPCS3, which also will be useful for any of those games that I didn't cover. The recent release of the Ally X was definitely part of the inspiration and motivation to create an updated video from last year. And I just have to say that we are truly so fortunate to be able to take PlayStation 3 on the go in this capacity. The Ally X has been pretty special in that regard, since many of the games in this showcase will sit on that battery, which is huge at 80 watt-hours, and I can't believe that we are so much closer to the reality of having much of the PlayStation 3 library available to us on a handheld device. Now for those that don't own an Ally X, this video will still be very useful for those with the original Ally with the Z1 Extreme, since the Ally X shares the same processor, as well as handhelds like the Lenovo Legion Go, and performance should also be quite similar for those with 7840U and 8840U handheld devices. This video is meant to be helpful for all of us that game on x86 devices, and so despite the presets applying to the Ally X, you can get a good idea of what to expect with just some adjustments to the TDP on your respective handhelds. As before, let's start with the install and setup process, then go through some of the configuration, motion controls, game patches, updates, tips, and a whole lot more. You can download RPCS3 directly from the official website at rpcs3.net, which will be linked down below. This is the safest place to download the emulator. Head on over to the download page and then grab the latest version available. Since I am using the Ally X, I will be using the latest build for Windows. Click on download and then save this 7-zip file to your computer. Once downloaded, extract the contents of the 7-zip file to a folder of your choosing. Okay, once you've extracted the contents, it's now time to launch RPCS3 for the first time. You might get a prompt saying that Windows protected your PC, but what does Windows really know? As long as you downloaded RPCS3 directly from their website, there's no concern here, so just click on more info and then the Run Anyway option will appear. This prompt will only appear for the first launch and should disappear for subsequent launches. You will get the Welcome to RPCS3 window, and you can select the options that you want, such as create a desktop shortcut, and then of course make sure to check off that you read the Quick Start Guide, which I do recommend quickly going through to familiarize yourself with RPCS3, and then finally the Do Not Show Again option so you don't get this window again, and then click Continue. Okay, now we're on the main screen of RPCS3, and this is where all the magic happens. But first things first, we need to go and grab the PlayStation 3 firmware. This is pretty simple to find, and a quick Google search will get you to where you need to go. I personally like Darth Sterney's website, which hosts the latest firmware, which is version 4.91. Okay, so on this page you can see there are download links for the official firmware, and you just click on download and save it to an easy to find location. The file name is ps3update.pup. Once downloaded, let's head on back to RPCS3 so we can install the firmware. Click on File, then Install Firmware, and point RPCS3 to the file that you just downloaded, which again is the PS3 update.pup file. RPCS3 will let you know that it's installing the firmware and that it was successfully done. Now, it's not quite done yet, as a new window will pop up and you will see the PPU modules compiling, which is normal and will take a minute or two depending on the device, so just let it do its thing. Once done, we'll be back on the main screen of RPCS3, and just take a moment to familiarize yourself with this screen since everything we need is within reach here. So naturally, we're installing RPCS3 to play some PlayStation 3 games, and typically the games come in two formats: the physical discs, which can be extracted, or the digital format from the PlayStation Network, usually in the .pkg format. Of course, I can't share here where you can obtain games from, but let's go through the process of installing a digital game as well as a disc-based game. I'll go ahead and use Heavenly Sword as an example. From the file dropdown, you can either choose to boot the game directly or just simply add it to your library and then boot it afterwards. I typically like using the second option since it gives me the opportunity to adjust any settings if I'm adding the game for the first time. So you can see that I have a folder with another folder labeled PS3_game. This is the folder that you want to load into RPCS3. Every disc-based game has a folder that is named exactly the same way, and that is the folder that you will add or boot. If you're having issues with your disc-based games, they are most likely not properly decoded for RPCS3 use. I highly recommend using the PS3 Disk Dumper tool, which I will have linked in the description. But that's all there is to it. It's not a very complicated process. And for digital games, it's very simple as well, and all you'll need to do is go back to the file dropdown and then select Install Packages. Again, digital format games will come in the .pkg format. I'll go ahead and use 1942 Joint Strike as an example. You can see I have the .pkg file, and then RPCS3 will ask you if you want to install the game. And after you click yes, it should appear in your list of games. But we're not quite done yet since the games need the corresponding RAP file, which will activate the license for the digital format game. So go back to File and then Install Packages and select the corresponding RAP file for the game. Alright, so now we're all done adding games. Now for the purpose of this video, games either work just by installing or loading the game and launching it, or some games will need changes to the default RPCS3 configuration. The config options can be found either under the configuration tab at the top of the RPCS3 window or by clicking on the config icon. So let's do just that and bring up the config settings, which will open a new window. The settings you see here are the default settings for RPCS3. Now throughout the video, I will let you know on screen if a game requires any changes to the default settings, and so it's a perfect time to cover per game configurations. On this screen, you will have your list of games that have been added and installed, and simply right-clicking on any of these games will bring up another set of options. One of those options is the ability to create a custom configuration from default settings. So let's click on that and then briefly go over some of the settings here, as I will be mentioning them throughout the video. As you can see, we have a new window that specifically configures the settings for Heavenly Sword as seen at the top. We have several tabs here, and in the video I will reference these tabs to help speed up where you need to go to either enable, disable, or adjust the options. So for example, if I mention that under CPU you need to change the SPU XFloat accuracy, this is where you would go to do it. Now for this video, I wanted to examine performance at 1080p as well as the default 720p resolution. This is something I didn't have an opportunity to do last year, and so since we're going bigger and better, I spent the time examining both 720p and 1080p performance with the majority of the games in this showcase. All games by default are set to use the 720p resolution, but some games either natively support 1080p or will require the resolution scaling option. The GPU tab is where you will go to adjust this setting. For games that support 1080p natively, it will be in the dropdown for the default resolution option. But not every PS3 game supports 1080p natively, and so we will adjust the resolution scale right below that. I will let you know for the most part if a game supports 1080p natively or if it requires the 150% scale for 1080p. It's important to note that using the resolution scaling can break some games. So if you're experimenting with games that are not included here, just keep that in mind. Likewise, 1080p is far more demanding than running at 720p, so expect that a lot of the more demanding games will most likely not work with 1080p, especially on these x86 handhelds. As you can see, Heavenly Sword does not support 1080p natively, so I'll just go ahead and set it to use a 150% scale for 1080p. Make sure to hit Save Custom Configuration before closing the window to save your settings. Now let's say you don't want that custom configuration that you've established. You can simply right-click on the game and then go to Remove and then Remove Custom Configuration. Easy peasy. Now while we're talking about per game configurations, let's also talk about game patches that are potentially available for a game. Most games in this showcase don't actually utilize this, but it is important to know about it, especially for some of the heavier titles like God of War 3, which does have patches to improve performance with the game. So again, if you right click on a game and then go to Manage Game Patches, a new window will appear. If this is the first time you're heading in there, you will get a prompt to update the patches, so go ahead and do just that. Now for God of War 3, for example, there are quite a number of patches available here, and I will let you know throughout the video if I utilized a patch for a specific game, but don't be shy and feel free to check out what games offer, since it's not always related to performance, and it's important to note that not every game will have a patch option. One last note I wanted to add for game patches is the Game Patch Manager that is accessible from the Manage dropdown at the top of the RPCS3 window. If you go to Manage and then Game Patches, you will get the Patch Manager on screen, and while I typically recommend doing this on a per game basis like I just demonstrated before this, there are a handful of games that need a patch from the All Titles section at the top, and if you expand this, you will see all serials and then a few games with the ability to disable the SPU MLAA. In particular, Twisted Metal is a game that I recommend enabling the Disable SPU MLA option, and is the only game in this entire showcase that requires this done on a universal level. So let's now talk about updates for each game, and for the majority of the games shown here, I am simply using the base or vanilla version of the game, and I will let you know if a game requires a certain update or a specific version to be used for the best performance. But this is the ultimate RPCS3 guide, and so I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about how to install updates for games. In the list view, you can see there is a version column that gives you information about the current version of the game installed or added, and then if the game has updates available. Thankfully, there's an awesome piece of software that helps you with this, which I will have linked in the description. Rusty PSN is a tool that lets you download any update packages for PS3 games and is a great and easy option for those that need specific updates. I recommend downloading the GUI version so that you have a user-friendly interface, which is the rusty-psn-egui zip file. Once you've downloaded the latest version, extract the exe file to an easy-to-find location, and then click on it to open it. Right now, this window isn't all too exciting, but if you head back to RPCS3 and then right-click on the game you want to update, scroll down to the Copy Info option, and then click on Copy Serial. Go back to Rusty PSN and then paste the serial number in the search box at the top. And you can see that for God of War 3, there is one update available, which is version 1.03. So click on download the file and it will automatically save it in a PKG folder that it creates. So now back to RPCS3 and simply go to File, Install Packages, and navigate to the PKG folder that Rusty PSN created, and select the PKG update file, and there you have it. Sometimes an update can break compatibility, so what if you want to uninstall an update? Well, simply go to the view at the top and then Game Categories and select Game Data. Now in List View, you will see not only the game, but also any game data that is associated with it. For example, we just updated God of War 3 to version 1.03, but I don't want that update anymore. So look for the category that says PS3 Game Data, and then right click on that and go to Manage Game and then remove PS3 Game Data, and that will remove the game update. And you can verify this by looking at God of War 3, which now shows version 1.00 and that there's an update available. Finally, this is very important. If there are multiple updates, you need to install the updates in order or else it will not work correctly. Okay, so we've covered quite a bit here, but one very important aspect is setting up the gamepad to work since, you can't really play your games without some type of input. To set up your gamepads, just simply click on the pads icon right on the RPCS3 screen. For ROG Ally users, make sure that the command center is set to the gamepad mode. You will want to make sure that the handler is set to X input and device is the X input pad number 1, and your controls should be automatically detected. You can remap and verify that the mapping is correct by selecting the input and then pressing the corresponding button or direction. Now, there are a few PS3 games that require motion input, and in the past, Handheld Companion was a good option, which I covered in last year's video, but currently is not working properly with the Ally X. And so right now there is no method to support motion controls with the built-in gyroscope of the Ally X. I've tried all sorts of different solutions, and unfortunately there isn't really a good way to go about this. And I hate to say it, but the best option is to actually use a DualSense controller, which works right out of the box and is also readily available for purchase. And so if you use your Ally or a similar handheld docked to a TV, then this is a pretty solid solution since the DualSense is natively supported by Windows through Bluetooth. Once you've connected your DualSense controller, it will appear as a DualSense option in the handler's dropdown. Again, make sure that for the devices it shows DualSense pad number 1, and if you notice, the motion controls configure button is no longer grayed out. Luckily, 95% of the games in this video don't require motion controls, or it can be disabled. Before we finally move on, let's talk about some last tips I have for everyone based on my experiences with RPCS3 over the years, and of course more recently just testing RPCS3 on handheld devices like the Ally X. One option to pay attention to under the Advanced tab in configuration is the driver wake-up delay setting. This is a good option to adjust if you have a game that is stubborn and either crashes a lot or locks up. Typically, if I have a problematic game, I'll start with 200 and then go from there. But again, it's just something to think about and another solution if you're having any issues. And for Ally users that want a nicer looking interface, my friend Zoo over at Retro Handhelds has a wonderful video that covers integrating your RPCS3 games into the Ally's Armory Crate software. I will have his video linked in the description, and I definitely recommend giving it a watch. Not just for RPCS3 integration, but for other emulators as well. Okay, so I always like to outline just some of the expectations with PlayStation 3 emulation. First things first, RPCS3 is in active development, and as such is constantly evolving. There can be cases where a newer version of RPCS3 will cause regressions, which I have an example of later on in this video. What this means is that a game may perform very well today, and could very well break tomorrow. But the good news is that older builds of RPCS3 are always accessible. Regardless, the expectation is that with all things being emulated, things may not be perfect. Which leads to the next point. PlayStation 3 emulation is very demanding, and in particular, the focus of this video is on x86 handheld devices which are still quite underpowered compared to the latest and greatest desktop computer. It's important to note that RPCS3 still does require some tweaking to get things just right. The purpose of this video is to make it as easy as possible, but don't be discouraged as there are many games that run very well and just run by simply loading the game and playing it. Finally, expect things like crashing, locking up, graphical glitches, and more that can happen or can be expected depending on the game. And again, RPCS3 is in constant development, and so what is an issue today might not be an issue tomorrow. So let's talk about the criteria this go around. Last year, I strictly focused on PS3 games that received a physical release, as well as some other requirements. Since we're going bigger this time around, I wanted to bring in some PlayStation Network games that I didn't have a chance to talk about, as well as incorporate some great third-party games that didn't see releases on PC, but also came out on Xbox 360, which I covered a bit in a video from last year. And like last year's video, all the games showcased here have not been released on PC natively. So we're finally ready to talk games, and let's start things out with a very light game that was only released on the PlayStation Network, as well as Xbox Live Arcade. 1942 Joint Strike is a remake of the original 1942 shmup from the arcades, and it's a pretty interesting title that I think for shmups fans is well worth checking out, especially since it was only available for the PlayStation Network and Xbox Live Arcade. It was developed by Backbone Entertainment, who was responsible for a lot of these PSN and Xbox Live Arcade entries, and it's one that hasn't been featured on the channel in a pretty long time. While it's a remake of 1942, it does combine some elements from other games in the series, and I think it's a very fun and solid remake of a classic arcade shmup. Given that this was a PSN game, I wasn't all too surprised that this one runs very well using the Ally X's 13-watt silent mode, and you can definitely set the visuals to use that 1080p resolution without any hit to performance. Next up, we have 3D Dot Game Heroes, and this is definitely one of those standout PS3 exclusives to me that really make you appreciate that RPCS3 exists, so that we can enjoy this game on more than just the PlayStation 3. For this game, you will want to set the SPU X float accuracy to accurate, otherwise the game will crash after the starting cutscene, which is still an issue, but once you change that setting, the game is working quite well. The game in general can randomly crash, which I experienced myself during playtesting, so save often and keep that issue in mind. It's still a great game to check out regardless, especially because it is only available on the PlayStation 3 and has never been ported anywhere else. On the Ally X, I was using the 13W solid mode preset, and honestly you could probably get away with a lower TDP on this one to really get some insane battery life. But at the 13W setting, I am set to use a 150% render scale for 1080p gameplay. 50 Cent Blood on the Sand is our next game and the first entry on this list that returns from my Xenia vs RPCS3 video from last year. As I mentioned earlier, this time around we are doing a big focus on PlayStation 3 emulation with RPCS3, and 50 Cent Blood on the Sand is a console exclusive that only saw release on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 with no PC version released. It is a game that remains locked to the 7th generation consoles, and it's actually an awesome game that is well worth checking out as a solid third-person shooter that features 50 Cent as well as music from him. This is one of the more demanding games out of the 100 or so being featured here, with the need to use the Ally X's 25W turbo mode to keep things as smooth as possible. I will say be prepared for a lot of shader compilation throughout gameplay, which is why it's nice to have the extra power on hand to smooth things out. Outside of that, this game doesn't need any specific settings changed, and we are using the default 720p resolution. Afro Samurai is a pretty cool console exclusive which also saw a release on the Xbox 360 and was developed by Namco Bandai Games and is based on the anime and manga of the same name. If you're a fan of either, it's worth checking out, but honestly I like it just as a fun action game, and even though it wasn't super highly rated, it's got great visuals and is pretty laid back. The best part is that this game runs very well on RPCS3 and doesn't need any changes from the default RPCS3 settings, and for this one I was set to use the Ally X's 13W silent mode preset, and this one in general should do quite well on other Z1 Extreme devices as well as the 7040U and 8840U. Afterburner Climax is an absolutely awesome entry in the Afterburner series that very much stays true to the Afterburner experience, sticking to the arcade-style gameplay that is fast and beautiful. Climax was a digital exclusive release on PlayStation Network and Xbox Live Arcade, and surprisingly saw ports to the mobile platforms. All versions of this game are no longer available and have been delisted well before their storefronts went offline. Again, this shows the importance of a project like RPCS3, which helps preserve this game for a long time to come, and it's definitely a fun one to check out that runs great with the default RPCS3 settings using the Ally X's 13W silent mode, and again is one that should fare very well on other similar handhelds. We've got another PlayStation Network exclusive that was released for both PlayStation 3 and 4. Amplitude is a reboot of the original Amplitude game that released back on the PlayStation 2, and for those that might remember, both Amplitude and the earlier game Frequency were the first games that the studio Harmonix developed, best known for the creation of Guitar Hero and Rock Band. Back in the day, both Amplitude and Frequency were some of my personal favorites, and in general I love most of Harmonix games, which typically tied music to video games. The reboot of Amplitude for PlayStation 3 might have not blown me away as much as the PS2 entries, but I still think it was a fun return to the gameplay concepts that got this studio started. Amplitude does very well with RPCS3, and on the Ally X I am using the 13W silent preset with a 150% resolution scale for 1080p, and it's having no issues staying nice and smooth. This game requires no changes to the default settings. Next up, we've got another Sega game with Anarchy Reigns, which is a console exclusive that also saw a release on the Xbox 360. This is an awesome beat-em-up game that comes to us from Platinum Games, the same studio responsible for the Bayonetta franchise. Anarchy Reigns is the spiritual successor to the Wii game Mad World. The beat-em-up genre is always a good time for me, and I think fans of the genre will have a lot to enjoy here, with it being an open-world beat-em-up game. Anarchy Reigns is quite the demanding game for RPCS3, and on the Ally X we will need to utilize that 25W turbo mode preset to get the performance that you're seeing on screen. The one bummer is that the visuals are blurry at its native setting, and it does really benefit from setting it to a 150% upscale for 1080p. But it actually ends up being too demanding for the Ally X at 25 watts, but you can plug it in to get that full 30 watts from the handheld for a slight boost in performance. Aquapazza is another full-blown PlayStation exclusive, and at this point I'd say is probably a forgotten 2D fighting game, which was published by Atlus in North America, and actually never received a release in Europe. This is a pretty cool 2D fighter that combines characters from various Aquapazza published titles. Unsurprisingly, this game has no issues running at the Ally X's 13-watt silent preset, and for this one I am set to use a 150% scale in resolution so we can enjoy the game at 1080p, and it still runs great at 13 watts. Other than that, this game runs with RPCS3's default settings and requires no additional adjustments. I'm excited to finally reach Armored Core, and there were a few titles released for the PlayStation 3 as well as the Xbox 360, and so these titles are console exclusives that never saw release outside of those platforms. For this video I am focusing on Armored Core For Answer, which is a direct sequel to Armored Core 4, and is probably going to be your best bet out of the Armored Core games. I tested various other Armored Core games, and this one had the least amount of issues for me personally, but it's still not perfect. You will definitely need a 25-watt turbo mode on the Ally X to help keep gameplay as smooth as possible. We also need to change a few settings. For the CPU, you will want to set the SPU decoder to ASM-JIT. For the GPU, you will want to enable write color buffers. And finally, for advanced, you will want to turn read color buffers on. Asura's Wrath is one of those games from the 7th generation that is an absolute banger of a game that only released on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, so it is a console exclusive, and I'm quite surprised that it hasn't been revisited or remastered in some capacity, and is easily one of the best games left behind with the 7th generation consoles. Asura's Wrath comes to us from Capcom and was developed by CyberConnect 2, probably best known for their work on the Dot Hack series and tons of Naruto games. I can best describe Asura's Wrath as an anime episode that comes to life in a video game, and it is over the top, satisfying, and a ton of fun that lets you take control of the demigod Asura in a blend of gameplay genres. If you've not heard of Asura's Wrath, I recommend checking it out for sure, especially if you are an anime fan in general. This one is really special, and it's a shame we haven't seen anything new since. Asura's Wrath also happens to run very well with RPCS3, and you can either go with the default 720p resolution at 13 watts, or bump it up and use a 150% resolution scale for 1080p, but for this I recommend going with the 17-watt performance preset with the Ally X. The game requires no changes from the default settings. Battlefield Bad Company is a pretty awesome entry in the Battlefield series. The game was designed as a console exclusive and only released on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, with a strong focus on the single player campaign. To this day, the only way you can play the first Bad Company game is on PlayStation 3 or Xbox 360, and so thanks to RPCS3, we have a great way to enjoy this game on PC. On the Ally X, you will definitely need 25 watts for the best performance. There is a 60 frames per second patch available, but you need to be on the version 1.20, and honestly, if you're rocking a handheld like the Ally X, it's probably best not to use it for this game as we really don't have enough power to sustain 60 frames per second on here. We do need to adjust some settings, and under GPU, you will need the write color buffers option enabled, which is needed to fix the dark graphics, and trust me, you will notice it without this setting on since it looks like the first level is taking place at night. Other than that, that's the only change needed, and just be mindful that there's a lot of shader compilation with this one, so just be patient with it. But performance will smooth out, and ultimately this one is very much pushing the limits of the hardware available. We've got another PlayStation 3 exclusive. Bleach Soul Resurrection is an action game based on the manga and anime of the same name. This is a pretty slick beat 'em up game, and quite a fun one at that, and I always have a good time with this genre. I think fans of the anime or manga will definitely enjoy this full-blown PlayStation exclusive, which was developed by Sony's Japan studio. For Bleach, I used the Ally X's 13-watt silent mode preset, and the game natively supports 1080p, which is what the game is set to in this footage. I did experience quite a number of lockups when playing, and so I recommend setting the driver wake-up delay to 200 under the advanced tab in settings, which helped minimize the lockups, but it is important to be mindful of the issue. Burnout Crash is an absolutely awesome console exclusive released for the digital storefronts on both PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. As the name suggests, this is a spin-off entry in the Burnout Racing franchise, influenced by Burnout's Crash mode. The game was developed by Criterion, and so the masters returned to develop something familiar but different, and it's just a blast to play. Ironically, the game is perfect for handheld devices, since it very much has a pick-up and play type gameplay style. Like Burnout's Crash mode, the goal is to cause a pileup, resulting in tons of damage. Unlike the Crash mode from the main entries, this game is played only from a top-down view, A fun little fact, this game is actually the last Burnout game developed by Criterion before the team moved on to focus on Need for Speed. For Burnout Crash, I have the game set to use a native resolution of 1080p using the Ally X's 13W preset with no issues at all. It's probably not at all unexpected that a Call of Duty game is making this massive list of games, but Call of Duty 3 is an interesting title to feature since it is a console exclusive never been released on PC. It is the only major installment of Call of Duty that was not released on PC. Instead, the Treyarch developed Call of Duty 3 was released for the PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, Xbox, Xbox 360, and Wii. So for us handheld PC gamers, we've got lots of ways to emulate this game, but the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 versions will be the best looking of the bunch. Call of Duty 3 runs very well at 13 watts if you're using the default 720p resolution, and with a 150% scale for 1080p, you will want to turn up to 17 watts on the Ally X to run it nice and smooth at that higher resolution. For those that want to further extend battery life, the 720p option will be the way to go, and is a good indication that many other handhelds should run this game quite well. I'm pretty excited to feature Calling All Cars again, and it's been quite some time since the last time I featured this game on the channel. Calling All Cars is a PlayStation Network exclusive and a full-blown PlayStation 3 exclusive that was directed by David Jaffe, the same mind behind games like Twisted Metal and God of War. Calling All Cars very much reminds me of Twisted Metal with its frantic gameplay, but this is played in a top-down perspective, and in this game you are trying to capture escaped convicts while battling against other bounty hunters trying to do the same, which results in a very hectic gameplay loop that is a ton of fun. Calling All Cars works great on the Ally X using the 13W silent mode preset, and I have the game set to use the 1080p resolution, which it does natively support. Captain America Super Soldier comes to us from Sega and Next Level Games. And I know what you're thinking, a licensed movie tie-in game. There's no way this could be decent. But Nintendo fans should be quite familiar with Next Level Games, since the studio is now part of Nintendo and has been responsible for some great games recently, like the Luigi Mansion sequels. Super Soldier is a pretty fun experience that takes place during the events of Captain America: The First Avenger. The graphics and gameplay are nothing groundbreaking, but it's a nicely put together package, and it even has the original cast reprising their roles for the voice acting and likenesses. This game is a bit demanding, and so I recommend setting a 30 frames per second cap for this one, since it doesn't seem to hit 60 frames per second even with the Ally's turbo mode. For this one, I recommend setting it to the default 720p resolution, which will allow us to get away with a 17W performance preset on the Ally X. I did experience a crash after some time playing through this, and so I recommend adjusting the driver wake-up delay as needed, which I personally set to 200. And another game that I'm pretty excited to feature is Child of Eden, which comes to us from the mind of Tetsuya Mizuguchi, the same mind behind Lumines and Rez. In many ways, Child of Eden is considered the spiritual successor to Rez, if that gives you a bit of idea of what to expect here, which I'd say is more of an experience than a game. Now, Child of Eden was designed originally for the Xbox Kinect, and then released a few months later for the PlayStation 3, with support for the PlayStation Move controllers. The PlayStation 3 version is noteworthy because it supports the DualShock as well, and so it's definitely worthy of an inclusion on this list, which is a full-blown console exclusive, and has never been seen outside of this release. Child of Eden performs beautifully with RPCS3, and you can go right ahead and use a 150% upscale, which will run the game at 1080p, using just the 13W silent mode preset on the Ally X. One last important thing, you can switch on the fly between the Move and DualShock inputs by pressing the select button. Comet Crash is a PlayStation Network exclusive, and it's a fun tower defense game and probably a bit of a forgotten gem at this point. Comet Crash is a perfect one to keep loaded on your handheld since it does lend itself well to pick up and play style gameplay. Like many other tower defense games, the premise here is to defend yourself against attacks, with this having a bit of a sci-fi focus. There's actually a sequel to this game which was released for the PlayStation 4. Comet Crash, like Child of Eden, does very well at the 13W silent mode preset, and the game supports 1080p natively, which is what the gameplay footage here is set to. Command & Conquer Red Alert 3 is an awesome entry in the long-running Command & Conquer franchise, which saw a release on PC, Mac, Xbox 360, and of course PlayStation 3. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. Why are we even wasting our time with the PlayStation 3 version of Red Alert 3 if we're on a Windows-based handheld? Now, the PS3 version is interesting because, like the Xbox 360 version, the game was designed to incorporate controller support for the home consoles, which means we can sit back and relax on our Ally handheld and play this game with controller support without the need for a keyboard and mouse. I think for many this will be an interesting version to check out, and the controller integration here is done really well. Red Alert 3 doesn't require any changes from the default settings and will run at 13 watts if you stick to the default 720p resolution, or you can choose to upscale to 150% for 1080p at 17 watts. Next up, we've got Dante's Inferno, which is an awesome hack and slash game that was developed by Visceral Games, the same studio behind the Dead Space games. Dante's Inferno was released on PSP and Xbox 360, so the PS3 version is not the only place you can play this. But naturally, since we've got a beefy Windows handheld, we might as well enjoy the better visuals of the PlayStation 3 version over the PSP one. This game does best at 17 watts when at the default 720p resolution, but it can also be enjoyed at 150% scale for 1080p at 25 watts if battery life is less of a concern. Other than that, this game requires no changes to the RPCS3 default settings. The Darkness is a first-person shooter based on the comic book series of the same name. This is a real gem of a game that at first seems like any other first-person shooter until you get to take control of the Darkness, a demonic force that can be utilized by the main character to violently take out enemies. The story is really awesome and takes place in my hometown of New York City, with equally great graphics for the time that just tie it all together to make this one of the more memorable games from the 7th generation. There is a sequel that was released that actually made its way to PC, but for the original game here, the only way to play this is either on the Xbox 360 or PlayStation 3, and so this is a console exclusive. The game does support 1080p natively and seems to do well at the 17-watt performance preset on the Ally X. It's important to note that this game has a weird glitch that will cause it to lock up when the intro is played. But no worries, it's simple to get around this, and you will need to be quick on the draw, no pun intended, by pressing start to bypass that intro. Detonation is both a PlayStation Network game as well as a full-blown PlayStation exclusive, releasing first for the PlayStation 3 with eventual ports to the PlayStation 4 and Vita. Detonation was developed by Housemarque, more recently known for Returnal. This game is best described as a top-down shoot-'em-up, a genre that I enjoy quite a bit, and probably comes as no surprise to longtime viewers that Detonation is a game that I enjoy quite a bit, putting some real time into the Vita version. Now, we do have options to emulate this game with either the Vita or PlayStation 3 versions, but in general I recommend going with the PS3 version since RPCS3 is just a much more mature and stable emulator. Fun fact, this game was included as part of Sony's Welcome Back package after the infamous PlayStation Network outage back in 2011. I don't think it's too surprising given that this is a lighter PlayStation Network game, but Detonation does run very well at 13 watts with a 150% upscale that allows the game to run in 1080p. Dead Space Extraction is a pretty interesting entry in the Dead Space franchise. The game was originally released as a Wii exclusive and then received a port to the PlayStation 3 a few years later. Extraction is not quite like the other games in the series, as this is a rail shooter that made use of Wii's motion capabilities, as well as the PlayStation Move. The good news is that the PS3 version has full support for the DualShock, so it can be enjoyed quite easily on the Ally X or any other handheld. Extraction takes place before the original game, and despite being a rail shooter, captures the atmosphere of the Dead Space games and is well worth playing through. You will need motion controls for this one, as the game does use the motion capabilities of the DualShock controller. I had an issue with this game when I set the resolution to 1080p, so I was only able to test it using the default 720p resolution, and unsurprisingly, since this is a port of a Wii game, Dead Space Extraction runs great with no changes to the default settings using the Ally X's 13-watt silent preset. We've got another PlayStation exclusive with Deception for Blood Ties and the expanded version, The Nightmare Princess. This game was first released for both the PlayStation 3 and Vita with an eventual port to the PlayStation 4. Deception 4 is a really interesting game that comes to us from Tecmo Koei and is part of the long-running Deception franchise. This is a strategy game that requires you to set up traps in order to prevent enemies from reaching you. There are all sorts of traps available that you can piece together in sequence in order to eliminate the enemy, and let me tell you, some of these can be pretty gruesome. Deception 4 runs very well with RPCS3, using the Ally X's 13-watt preset at the default 720p resolution and at a 150% upscale for 1080p. Deception 4 would mark the last time that we got a new entry in this franchise. Demon's Souls was very much a big deal when it first was showcased as being playable in RPCS3, and would remain a big deal for PlayStation 3 emulation, at least until the PlayStation 5 remake that released a few years ago. Regardless, for PC players, the PlayStation 3 version is still the only way to really enjoy this game on PC, and remains the highlight of RPCS3 to this day. Unsurprisingly, Demon's Souls runs incredibly well with RPCS3, and so on the Ally X, we only need the 13-watt preset to enjoy the game at its default resolution of 720p. The only change needed from the default settings is to enable the right color buffers under GPU. If you do want to run the game at a 150% scale in 1080p, you will need to change the texture scaling to 640 by 640 under GPU to properly scale the depth of field effect. Dragon's Crown is a game that is no stranger to the channel, having been featured countless times as a game that works incredibly well with RPCS3 and on quite a number of devices, since its power requirements are among some of the lowest when it comes to PlayStation 3 emulation. This is a fantastic action RPG from the folks at Vanillaware, and is also a full PlayStation exclusive that saw a simultaneous release on the PlayStation 3 and Vita, with it eventually making its way over to the PlayStation 4. The game supports native 1080p, and at the Ally X's 13-watt silent preset, this game is having no issues with performance. In fact, I'd say you probably can set a custom TDP for this, because it really doesn't need a whole lot for the Z1 Extreme, as well as the 7840U and 8840U handhelds. Drakengard 3 returns from last year's video and has been a consistently stable game with RPCS3. This is the third entry in the Drakengard franchise and takes place before the events of the original Drakengard game released back on the PlayStation 2. The Nier franchise acts as a spin-off to the Drakengard games, and so if you are a fan of those games, it's definitely worth checking out the Drakengard franchise. As I mentioned, I featured this game last year, and it doesn't require any changes from the default RPCS3 settings. This time around, I wanted to see how it handled upscaling, and so here we are using a 150% scale for 1080p, using the Ally X's 17-watt performance preset with excellent results. I'd say stick to 17 watts as it does provide an overall smoother experience. Next up, I've got a set of Dynasty Warriors Gundam games, and first let's talk about Dynasty Warriors Gundam 3, which is a console exclusive released on both PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. As the name implies, this is the third entry in the Dynasty Warriors Gundam series, and like Dynasty Warriors, is a hack and slash style game with the Gundam license. I always love the Musou type games, and this one is no exception, especially if you're a fan of the Gundam universe. Dynasty Warriors Gundam 3 is a game that works great with RPCS3 and doesn't require any changes from the default settings using just the 13-watt preset. The game can be enjoyed at 1080p using a 150% scale, and naturally will be a little bit more demanding, so for that, use the 17-watt preset. The game looks phenomenal at 1080p, and it really does let the graphics and art come through. And for our second Dynasty Warriors Gundam game, I wanted to feature Reborn, which is a full-blown PlayStation exclusive and released only for the PlayStation 3 and Vita. The performance here is quite similar to Dynasty Warriors Gundam 3, and again doesn't require any changes from the default settings. For the default 720p resolution, the 13-watt silent mode preset will be more than enough to handle gameplay. If you're wanting 1080p, you can make use of the 150% scale, and for that again, I recommend going to the 17-watt performance mode preset on the Ally X to really keep things nice and smooth. Regardless, this game is beautiful at either resolution, and like Gundam 3, is a ton of fun to play. The 7th generation was definitely no stranger to reboots and remakes, and Earthworm Jim would be one of those games that received the remake treatment. Earthworm Jim HD is, as its name implies, a high-definition remake of the game with beautifully upgraded art. In fact, everything here was redone, and none of the original game code was used to recreate Earthworm Jim HD, which is both good and bad since some of the gameplay elements definitely did not age as well, and so for newcomers to the game or series, might not be as receptive to this one. But if you're a huge fan of Earthworm Jim, I definitely think the HD version is worth checking out, and is a full-blown console exclusive for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, with an obscure port to the Windows Phone platform. Given what we've seen so far, it's no surprise that Earthworm Jim HD works great with RPCS3 using a 150% resolution scale for 1080p with the Ally X's 13-watt silent preset and requires no changes from the default settings. Fat Princess is a game that I believe I've never featured before on the channel, especially on the PlayStation 3 side. This is a full-blown PlayStation exclusive published by Sony that also received a port to the PlayStation Portable. It was a PlayStation Network exclusive, and so it's definitely worth including here for this showcase. The game is pretty interesting as well, and it's best described as a real-time action strategy game that is quite fun and frantic. The game was primarily designed as a multiplayer game that supported up to 32 players with 16 players per team. Each team has a princess that they must prevent the other team from taking back to their castles. So in order to make it more difficult for your opponent, you would have to feed the princess slices of cake to make her heavier and harder to carry back to the respective castle. It's a funny game with great visuals that works great with RPCS3 and supports 1080p natively and runs very well using the 13-watt silent mode preset on the Ally X. I'd say that this is a game that will fare quite well on many different devices. Folklore returns from last year's video, and it's definitely well deserved as it's a PlayStation 3 exclusive that will most likely never be seen again anywhere else, which means that RPCS3 is the only way to enjoy this game on PC. Folklore is a Sony published action RPG that was an early highlight for the PlayStation 3 library, and to this day remains a notable exclusive. Luckily, the game works very well with RPCS3 and doesn't require any changes from the default settings. This time around, I tested the game with a 150% upscale for 1080p gameplay, and using the Ally X's 17-watt performance mode preset, the game works very well. You can probably get away with the 13-watt preset, but I do like having the extra power to keep things as smooth as possible. Just a note, the game does require motion controls, and so you will need to be able to enable that in order to progress through it properly. Full Auto 2 Battle Lines is another game returning from last year's video and is a full PlayStation exclusive, which first released on PlayStation 3 and then received a port to the PlayStation Portable. Oddly enough, this is a sequel to the original Full Auto, which was an Xbox 360 exclusive. Go figure. The PlayStation 3 version naturally is going to be the most visually impressive, and this time around I wanted to showcase the game making use of the native 1080p that the game supports, which is fairly demanding here and does require the Ally X's 25-watt turbo mode to run as smoothly as possible, which still won't reach 60 frames per second, but I don't think it impacts gameplay too much since it's still fast, playable, and it does look beautiful in 1080p. Alternatively, the 720p default works well at the 17-watt preset. Galaga Legion's DX is a new entry for the RPCS3 showcase, and it's a game that I just don't get enough opportunities to talk about, so I partly wanted to include it here since it's a pretty awesome game. Galaga Legions is a twin-stick shooter and the 14th entry in the Galaxian franchise. This is a fun and visually stunning game with frantic bullet hell style gameplay that was developed by the same team responsible for Pac-Man Championship Edition. Unsurprisingly, the game performs very well using just the 13-watt silent preset on the Ally X and requires no additional changes to the default RPCS3 settings. We've finally made it to God of War, and specifically we will talk about the two PlayStation 3 entries of the franchise, with God of War 3 up first, which remains to this day as one of the benchmarks for PlayStation 3 emulation with RPCS3 and is still one of the most demanding to emulate. I didn't specifically feature this one last year in my RPCS3 video since I talked about it during my ROG Ally review video, but this time around I wanted to have both of the God of War games featured. Both games will require some tweaking for the best performance possible with the Ally X and the Z1 Extreme and any similar devices. For God of War 3, I recommend using all of the performance game patches that are available, which will allow us to really get performance up there. At the Ally X's 25-watt turbo mode preset, we can almost get to 60 frames per second, which is absolutely insane for this game, especially on a handheld device. Now because of this, we do have some options, and we can either cap the frame rate to 30, which lets us drop the power requirements to a 17-watt TDP, which can handle 30 frames per second without issue. For this game, under the CPU settings, we will need to change the SPU block size to Mega. Under the GPU settings, enable the right color buffers option and asynchronous texture streaming. Finally, in advance, change the RSX FIFO accuracy to Atomic. Now moving on to God of War Ascension, this game is even more demanding than God of War 3 for RPCS3 on these handhelds, which means that we are limited to just the default 720p resolution, but we will need to use the 25-watt turbo mode preset on the Ally X to get the performance that you are seeing on screen here, which mostly stays above 30 frames per second. Like God of War 3, I recommend using all of the available performance-related game patches, which means you will need to update the game to version 1.04 in order to use those available patches. For this game, under the CPU option, change the SPU block size to Mega. Under GPU, change the Z-code accuracy to approximate and enable the right color buffers option. Finally, under the advanced options, enable the accurate RSX reservation access, change the sleep timer's accuracy to as host, and change the RSX FIFO accuracy to atomic. We've got another game that I haven't shown before with RPCS3. GoldenEye 007 Reloaded is an enhanced port of the Wii remake of the iconic GoldenEye 007 released back on the Nintendo 64. The remake was not developed by Rare, instead Eurocom handled development duties for this game, which was published by Activision. I first played this when it was released on Wii, and I really enjoyed this take on GoldenEye, which updated the entire experience of the Nintendo 64 version, including swapping out Pierce Brosnan with Daniel Craig. There's a lot to enjoy here, especially for GoldenEye fans, since I think they did a great job with modernizing the game, including the gameplay. The game is a console exclusive and was never brought over to PC, and so emulation is the only way to enjoy this game on PC. The PlayStation 3 version works great with RPCS3 and plays well using either the default 720p resolution with the 13W preset or a 150% upscale for 1080p, but you will need to bump up the Ally X to the 25W turbo mode preset to enjoy the higher resolution. By the way, the game does support 1080p natively, but for some reason it causes a black screen, so you will need to go with the 150% scale option instead. There's very few franchises as iconic as the Gran Turismo series, and unsurprisingly, considering the success of the games, the PlayStation 3 saw a few releases including some demos and teasers. Gran Turismo 5 is the 5th main installment and the 10th overall in the franchise, which definitely kept fans waiting as it didn't get released until 2010, a few years after the console launched. Now for Gran Turismo 5, it took me a decent amount of effort to get it to work. For whatever reason, I had a lot of issues with the vanilla version of Gran Turismo 5, and so for this, I am specifically using the XL edition, which I was able to get running. It's important to note that the earlier versions of the game are preferred because they are less demanding performance-wise, but unfortunately with the XL edition, it is using a more current version of the game. Gran Turismo 5 has a ton of shader compilation, and it will smooth out quite a bit, but you will have to be patient with it since it's one of the most demanding games that I'm going to be showing here for RPCS3, despite using the 25W turbo mode preset with the Ally X. Now a little trick for the shader compilation is to actually wait a little bit before starting a race, since it's previewing the track and race and it will allow the shader compilation to take place. We can obviously forget about any upscaling here since the game is demanding as is with the default 720p resolution. The game does have issues regardless of the device you're playing it on, but in general they don't affect gameplay. These are usually found in replays, the photo mode, and other non-gameplay sections. For some ways to address those issues, definitely check out the RPCS3 wiki, but unfortunately not all of them can be fixed at this time. I tested this game quite extensively, and I found that just leaving the default settings was the best and most stable with the Ally X. And then of course let's talk about Gran Turismo 6, which somehow only came out 3 years later, and I feel like that was a very fast turnaround time for a Gran Turismo game. Gran Turismo 6 is the first game in the franchise to officially feature FIA certified content, as well as featuring the first ever Australian-based racetrack, and was a pretty substantial improvement over Gran Turismo 5, and luckily it seems that Gran Turismo 6 is the more stable option with RPCS3, at least on the Ally X. This game is as demanding as Gran Turismo 5, and so we are set to use the default 720p resolution, as well as the 25W turbo preset with the Ally X, and Gran Turismo 6 also has a ton of shader compilation, so it's another that will require some patience. Again, you can use the same trick as Gran Turismo 5 and let RPCS3 do the shader compilation, but for starting a race as it pans over the track and previews the race. The game does stay mostly at 30 frames per second, but of course this is very track dependent. For this game I did make some changes to the default configuration, and under CPU, change the SPU block size to Mega, and under Advanced, enable the accurate RSX reservation access, and change the RSX FIFO accuracy to Atomic. Hardcore's Uprising makes a return to the channel, having been featured in various ways in the past. Now, it wasn't featured in the big RPCS3 video last year since I focused on games that had physical releases. As such, Hardcore's Uprising did not make the list, but that changes this time around and it really is a worthy inclusion. Uprising is a digital console exclusive releasing on both PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. At first glance, you might not realize it, but this is actually part of the Contra franchise and was published by Konami. This game serves as the prequel to the original game as well as Contra Hardcore. This game was also developed by Arc System Works, best known for the Guilty Gear and BlazBlue franchises, and I do think the art style here kinda gives it away just a bit. For fans of Contra and even Metal Slug, this is a fun game worth checking out, and like so many other PSN games, it works incredibly well with RPCS3, running in its native 1080p resolution with just the Ally X's 13-watt silent mode preset. We've got a pretty interesting one here, and I can almost guarantee that it's all but forgotten at this point. Haze is a full-blown PlayStation 3 exclusive first-person shooter from Free Radical Design, the same studio responsible for the awesome Time Splitters games. Haze, at least back in the day, was slated as the Halo killer for the PlayStation 3, and when it finally released, it wasn't all that well received. Sadly, the failure of Haze was probably part of the reason that Free Radical Design went into bankruptcy, and even years later, it would be considered one of the most disappointing and worst video games on the PlayStation 3. I chose not to feature this game last year, and this is the first time that Haze is making an appearance on the channel. Haze does run pretty well with RPCS3, and for this footage I am set to use a 150% scale for 1080p using the Ally X's 17-watt performance mode preset, which is the smoothest. The only change needed for this game is to enable the right color buffers option under GPU. Heavenly Sword is one of my absolute favorite games on the PlayStation 3, and to this day is still a full exclusive for the console. It's been featured many times here, as well as in last year's video. For those unfamiliar with this game, it was developed by Ninja Theory, the same studio more recently responsible for great games like Hellblade. Sadly, I don't think we will ever see a remaster or re-release of this game, and so RPCS3 remains one of the ways we can still enjoy it today. I wanted to test performance with 1080p using the 150% resolution scale, but the game kept locking up for me once I started playing a bit. I don't get this issue when I leave it at the default 720p resolution, so I guess for this one, it's best to just leave things alone. At the default 720p resolution, this game does perform quite well, even at the 13-watt silent mode preset on the Ally X. It doesn't need any changes from the default RPCS3 settings as well. So, I don't know about others, but I really do love light gun games, and one that's been part of my life for a very long time has been House of the Dead, which has seen multiple versions and ports since the very first release way back in 1997. I have fond memories of enjoying the franchise both in arcades and at home. Now I'm pretty excited to talk about House of the Dead 4, since this is not only a PlayStation 3 exclusive, but it was released only on the PlayStation Network, so it's both a PS3 and a digital exclusive. For those that enjoy light gun games or just House of the Dead, this is another fun entry in the franchise. The game was developed with move support, but can also be enjoyed with a controller, and of course on a handheld like the Ally X, this is a very important thing. For this footage, I went with a 150% scale for 1080p, and using the 17-watt performance mode preset on the Ally X, this is mostly a smooth experience, and it's a surprisingly demanding game. I will say that it's absolutely worth upscaling this game as it looks beautiful in 1080p. Other than that, the game just works with the default RPCS3 settings. Hot Shots Golf Out of Bounds is the first game I noticed that had a real regression from last year's video, and so unfortunately with the current versions of RPCS3, performance has greatly suffered with Out of Bounds, which is a full-blown PlayStation 3 exclusive. For this game, you will want to use an older version of RPCS3, probably a version dated prior to my video from last year, which was around July of 2023. Thankfully, we do have another Hot Shots Golf game that was released on PlayStation 3. Hot Shots Golf World Invitational was first released as a Vita exclusive and then ported a year later to the PlayStation 3. The PlayStation 3 version works incredibly well with RPCS3, and the game supports 1080p natively using just the 13-watt silent mode preset on the Ally X, which really makes the visuals come through and it just looks beautiful. I'm just glad that despite the regression with Out of Bounds, at least there's a Hot Shots Golf game that can be enjoyed with current builds of RPCS3. Additionally, the game doesn't require any changes from the default RPCS3 settings. We finally made it to another set of games that are quite iconic on the PlayStation 3 and really highlights just how good the output was from Sony's first-party studios on the console. Sucker Punch Productions' infamous franchise got its start on the PlayStation 3, and it was quite a departure for the studio, who at the time was known for the development of the Sly Cooper franchise. The infamous series is an action-adventure game that introduced a lot of very cool concepts at the time, including using the main character Cole's superpowers to traverse the city in an unconventional manner. Now, for RPCS3, the infamous games are all quite demanding, and they will all exhibit mostly similar performance for the 3 games being featured here. So for the first entry, we do need to make some changes to the default RPCS3 settings. For the CPU, we will need to change the SPU X-float accuracy to accurate. Under GPU, we will need to change the Z-col accuracy to relaxed, and enable the multi-threaded RSX, as well as the asynchronous texture streaming. Finally, in the advanced section, we will need to change the sleep timer's accuracy to as host and the RSX FIFO accuracy to atomic. Infamous is being played at the default 720p resolution, and despite that still needs the 25W turbo mode preset to get the performance that you are seeing here. I will say that even though performance is generally solid and playable, there are definitely plenty of dips into the 20s depending on the gameplay segment. And as I mentioned earlier, it will be much of the same story for the sequel Infamous 2, which does use the same engine as the first entry, and as such, it's not all too surprising. Cole returns for the sequel, which provides more of the same for fans of the franchise. Similar to Infamous 1, we will need to make some changes to the default RPCS3 settings. Under GPU, we will need to change the Z-col accuracy to relaxed, and enable both multi-threaded RSX as well as asynchronous texture streaming. Under Advanced, we need to change the sleep timer's accuracy to as host and the RSX FIFO accuracy to atomic. Again, I am set to use the 25W turbo mode preset on the Ally X, and generally performance is mostly decent, but be patient with shader compilation and expect those frame rate dips depending on the gameplay segments. These are very demanding games for RPCS3 and PlayStation 3 emulation, and definitely pushing the limits of the Ally X and the Z1 Extreme, which means you should expect similar performance for the 7840U and 8840U devices. Finally, we have one last Infamous game to talk about, which was more of a standalone DLC, but it's still worth talking about, and a fun little spin-off based on Infamous 2. Festival of Blood takes our protagonist Cole and follows his transformation into a vampire. This is meant to be a spoof story told by Zeke, who is Cole's best friend, and so it ties in perfectly with the franchise. Since Cole is transforming into a vampire, he now has new powers to go along with his existing ones, including drinking blood to regain health. Similar to the other entries, Festival of Blood will require some changes to the default RPCS3 configuration. For the GPU, you will need to change the Z-col accuracy to relaxed and enable both multi-threaded RSX and asynchronous texture streaming. And for the advanced setting, the sleep timer's accuracy will need to be changed to as host and the RSX FIFO accuracy to atomic. We are still set to use the default 720p resolution of the game, and the Ally X is set to the 25W turbo mode preset for the footage shown here. Again, expect that performance will be generally decent, but with dips here and there based on the gameplay and shader compilation. And it definitely bums me out that we haven't received a new entry in the Infamous franchise in more than 10 years. What is going on over at Sony? Okay, time to move on from the Infamous games, and let's now check out one for anime fans with J-Star's Victory vs. Plus, which is a crossover fighting game that combines the universes of several Shonen Jump series, including franchises like Bleach, Dragon Ball, Fist of the North Star, and Naruto, to name a few. Versus Plus is the Western re-release that features an additional arcade mode and is a full-blown PlayStation exclusive, with releases on the Vita, PlayStation 3, and PlayStation 4. There's tons of content here with this game, including a story mode called J Adventure that takes place in the Jump world. This game is an excellent performer with RPCS3, and on the Ally X, I am set to use the 13W silent mode preset, with no changes required from the default RPCS3 settings. I am using a 150% resolution scale for 1080p, and it's very smooth at just 13W and works great with RPCS3. I'm always excited anytime I get a chance to talk about a Katamari game, and it just so happens that the PlayStation 3 received a Katamari entry, and an exclusive one at that. Katamari Forever is much of the same for the franchise, and so if you're a fan, definitely check it out. But if you didn't enjoy the prior entries, this one doesn't change much. In Forever, there's a fun twist to the usual levels, where half of the game is played in black and white, and so you need to roll up junk to restore color to the stages, which restores the King of All Cosmos' memory. We also have the introduction of the Robo-King, a robotic version of the King of All Cosmos that was created by the Prince and his cousins. One thing's for sure, it's as wacky as ever, and pretty typical for a Katamari game in that sense. Katamari Forever is another game that works really well with RPCS3, requiring no changes from the default settings. For the footage, I am set to use the game's native 1080p resolution, using the 13W silent mode preset on the Ally X, which works great. We've got a bunch of PlayStation mainstays coming up next. Let's first talk about the Killzone games, and first with Killzone 2. I remember when the E3 2005 trailer dropped for Killzone 2 and how much hype there was around the visuals that were presented in the trailer, with some speculating that there was no way it was in-game gameplay that we were seeing. Well, it turned out to be true that the video was built with PS3 specs in mind, and as such, was in fact not real footage direct from a PlayStation 3. Well, that's very long in the past now, and today we get to play Killzone 2 on our PCs thanks to the wonderful work by the RPCS3 team. Killzone 2 is a full-blown PlayStation 3 exclusive developed by Guerrilla Games, who is now busy working on the Horizon franchise and has long since moved away from Killzone. Killzone 2 really was a big step up from the original entry on PlayStation 2, and the power that came with the PlayStation 3 clearly allowed the team at Guerrilla Games to convey their vision for the franchise, which made Killzone 2 a superior game in every single way. I don't think it's too surprising that this is another very demanding game for PlayStation 3 emulation and RPCS3. We are set to use the default 720p resolution and at the Ally X's 25W turbo mode preset to get the performance that you are seeing here. We do need to make a few changes from the default settings. For CPU, we need to change the SPU block size to Mega. Under GPU, we need to enable the write color buffers option. And finally, under Advanced, we will need to set the RSX FIFO accuracy to Atomic. I do recommend enabling the disabled post-processing on SPU game patch for this game to increase performance. Let's now move on to the sequel, Killzone 3, which mostly resembles Killzone 2 but does introduce some cool features like motion control support using the Move controllers, as well as the ability to play split-screen co-op in the campaign mode. Killzone 3 continues the story of its predecessor, as well as all of the elements that made Killzone 2 some of the best gaming experiences on the PS3. To this day, I think Killzone 2 and 3 are easily some of the best exclusives that the PlayStation 3 had. Similar to Killzone 2, we will need to make some changes to the default RPCS3 settings. For the CPU, we need to change the SPU block size to Mega. For the GPU, the Z-Col accuracy to Relaxed, and enable the write color buffers option. And again, in game patches, I recommend enabling the Disable MLAA for the most performance. Let's now switch over to another very popular PlayStation franchise, Little Big Planet, which got its start on the PlayStation 3 and would go on to spawn multiple sequels and spin-offs. I remember when the first Little Big Planet came out, and I was just blown away by the level of creativity, especially with the community aspects of the game. In fact, Little Big Planet is credited with its influence in the play, create, and share genre, and released at a time which saw the rise of user-generated content. There's no doubt about it that Little Big Planet is still influential to this day, and even Sackboy has gone on to become an iconic part of the PlayStation branding. For Little Big Planet 1, you will need to update the game to at least version 1.21, or else you will get an infinite loading screen. Not only that, but you must update the game in order of the updates, and you cannot skip any updates since it will cause the game to crash after the initial compilation. Other than the update requirement, this game doesn't need any changes from the default RPCS3 configuration and works great with either the 720p default resolution at 13 watts, or like in this footage, you can make use of the 150% upscale for 1080p, which will need the 17W preset on the Ally X for the smoothest performance. Now for the sequel, Little Big Planet 2, we do need to make a few changes from the default RPCS3 configuration. Under GPU, you will need to enable the write color buffers option, and under Advanced, enable the Silent All Logs option. This game is a bit more demanding, and I found that the best option is to play this at the default 720p resolution with the 17W performance mode preset on the Ally X for a stable 30 frames per second. I found that when I had the game set to use a 150% scale for 1080p, the game would not stay locked to 30 frames per second, even with the 25W turbo mode preset on the Ally X. Also, this game doesn't have any issues with requiring certain updates. Let's now talk about Little Big Planet 3, which unlike Little Big Planet 1 and 2, saw a release for both the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4. Not only that, but this game was not developed by Media Molecule, and instead, Sumo Digital took over development duties for Little Big Planet 3. Despite this, Sumo Digital did a great job continuing the legacy of the series and gave fans of the Little Big Planet franchise more of the same. Similar to Little Big Planet 2, I think that the default 720p resolution at the 17W performance mode preset is the best balance for performance with the Ally X. We do need to make a few changes from the default RPCS3 settings. Under Advanced, we need to enable both Silence All Logs and the Read Color Buffers option. As I mentioned earlier, Little Big Planet went on to have multiple sequels and spin-offs, and one of those spin-off games was Little Big Planet Karting, which is a kart racer inspired by the world of Little Big Planet. It's an awesome entry and concept that hasn't been revisited since, as well as being exclusive to the PlayStation 3 to this day. Just like the mainline games, 17W seems to be a sweet spot for karting, as well as at the 720p default resolution. Initially, I had an issue with the game just showing a black screen, but it still had working prompts. I closed the game and restarted it, and that seemed to resolve the issue. There is a known problem with stage 5-3, and if you do encounter the issue, you will need to change the SPU decoder to ASMJIT under CPU. Otherwise, the only permanent change needed to be made here is under GPU, enabling the right color buffers option. I'd say this one is a definite improvement from what I saw performance-wise last year with RPCS3 on the original Ally. Longtime viewers of the channel know just how much I love the Lumines franchise, as well as the multiple games from Q Entertainment and Tetsuya Mizuguchi, who is responsible for other favorites of mine like Rez and Tetris Effect. Lumines Supernova is an exclusive PlayStation 3 entry of the franchise and features a lot of the same seen in prior versions of Lumines. This game does share some similarities with Lumines Live and includes an expanded version of the sequencer from Lumines 2, as well as a new game mode called Dig Down. For fans of Lumines, it's more of the same, and that's not a bad thing at all since they are all a ton of fun, and best of all, Supernova works incredibly well with RPCS3, using the native 1080p option at just the 13W silent mode preset, with the Ally X, and gameplay is essentially as smooth as can be. Oh yeah, here we are, probably one of the biggest reasons most PlayStation 3 fans are interested in RPCS3. Metal Gear Solid 4 is one of the most noteworthy games from the PlayStation 3 that is still exclusive to the platform, and thanks to the magic done by the RPCS3 team, it can be enjoyed by many on PC. It was an exciting game to feature last year on the original Ally, since we were finally getting to a point that the game could be enjoyed on a handheld device like the Ally. Things mostly stay the same here from last year, and yes, this game still has easily one of the longest initial compilation times, so you might as well grab a snack or a full meal because it's gonna be a while. One thing I recommend doing this time around is to update the game to version 2.0, which will allow you to make use of the patches for version 2.0, such as disabling some of the effects like shadows to squeeze more performance out of the game. And overall, it's pretty solid, staying mostly at or above 30 frames per second. And stability is quite good as well, but I did have the game crash on me once right at the first gameplay segment, but thankfully subsequent playthroughs were pretty solid. For this game, we do need to make some changes to the default RPCS3 settings. Under GPU, set the frame limit to 60, the Z-call accuracy to relaxed, and enable the right color buffers option. Under Advanced, enable accurate RSX reservation access, check off the libvdec.sprx under firmware libraries, and set the RSX FIFO accuracy to atomic. Again, I definitely recommend updating to version 2.0 for those game patches. Next up, we have a franchise that Rockstar Games seems to have forgotten all about. Midnight Club Los Angeles is the fourth and sadly final installment in the Midnight Club franchise, and as a big racing game fan, I absolutely love all of the Midnight Club games. I featured this game last year for the original Ally in a video comparing the performance between Xenia Canary and RPCS3. In that video, I found that performance was better overall in Xenia Canary for this game specifically, and not much has really changed here. The game is definitely playable with RPCS3, but for those with the Ally or similar devices, I think you are better off emulating this in Xenia Canary. Regardless, for those that want to play this in RPCS3, you will need to make a few changes to the default RPCS3 configuration. Under CPU, set the SPU block size to Mega. For GPU, set the Z-call accuracy to relaxed, and enable the right color buffers and multi-threaded RSX options. In advanced, set the sleep timer's accuracy to as host. The game will mostly be unable to hit a solid 30 frames per second even with the Ally X's 25W turbo mode preset using the default 720p resolution. Now for a game that does run very well with RPCS3, we have Mod Nation Racers, which is a PlayStation exclusive that released for both the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation Portable. The game was developed by United Front Games, the same studio responsible for Little Big Planet karting, and so this should give you a good idea of what to expect with this one, which is another kart racing game that is heavily inspired by Little Big Planet, focusing on the concepts that started with the franchise with the play, create, and share mechanics. This is another fun kart racing game that did receive a sequel over on the PlayStation Vita, but has since remained dormant and forgotten. We do need to make a few changes for this game. Under GPU, we need to change the Z-Call accuracy to relaxed and enable the right color buffers option. Other than that, Mod Nation Racers runs very well, and you can either go with the 13W preset for the default 720p resolution, or take things up a notch and go with the 17W performance mode preset for 1080p using the 150% resolution scale. Next up, we've got another set of great PlayStation games that also began life on the PlayStation 3 with the MotorStorm franchise. First, let's talk about the original MotorStorm, which released very early on for the PlayStation 3, and for me was easily one of these standout games that inevitably led me to scrounging up whatever limited funds I had as a college student and picking up my first PlayStation 3 console. At the time, the graphics definitely blew me away with the awesome mud effects and physics, and as a racing game fan, I loved every minute of it. This game had some weird performance at first, so I needed to go back and tweak things further than what was called for to get the performance that you're seeing here in this footage. I'd say that this 17W performance mode preset is mostly going to get you the performance that you want with the Ally X, and you can forget about using 150% scaling for 1080p since it's far too demanding even with the 25W turbo mode. The footage here is with the game running at 25 watts, and so you will probably be switching presets to help keep things steady. For this game, we need to change a few things from the default RPCS3 settings. This is a deviation from the RPCS3 compatibility wiki, and really the goal here is to smooth out performance as much as possible on these handheld devices. Under CPU, I recommend changing the SPU block size to Mega. Under GPU, set the Z-Call accuracy to relaxed and enable the right color buffers option. Under Advanced, enable the read colors buffers option. I also set the anisotropic filtering to 16x under GPU to try and clean up the visuals a little bit, since the game is pretty blurry looking at the default 720p resolution. We're going to step a little bit out of alphabetical order here and talk about the sequel, which was MotorStorm Pacific Rift. For Pacific Rift, the MotorStorm franchise moved away from the desert environment, and now we've got a beautiful island environment, which further pushes the incredible visuals with the series. As much as I love the original, I think Pacific Rift improved on it in nearly every way, and it's just an awesome sequel to a great game. Pacific Rift's performance really surprised me, and it's running very well with RPCS3. Similar to the first game, I recommend using the 17W performance mode preset with the Ally X, and again 1080p will be a bit too demanding for the device, even with the 25W turbo mode preset. For this game, the only setting I needed to change from the default RPCS3 configuration was to enable the right color buffers option under GPU. Other than that minor change, the game runs very well, and honestly I think it's the best performing and most stable out of the three mainline MotorStorm games. But we're not quite done yet with MotorStorm, as there was another sequel released in the mainline series for the PlayStation 3 with MotorStorm Apocalypse, and this is easily the most demanding of the MotorStorm games, and similar to what we saw last year when I featured this game, specifically in my RPCS3 video, we will need a 25W turbo mode with the Ally X to get the best performance possible with this game. It's still not quite perfect, but in general it does allow for things to be pretty smooth and stable. For this game, we will need a few changes. Under the CPU, change the SPU block size to Mega, and under GPU, the Z-Call accuracy to relaxed, as well as enable the right color buffers option. Now, all three of these MotorStorm games I just talked about are full-blown PlayStation 3 exclusives that to this day have not been released anywhere else, and thankfully can be enjoyed with RPCS3. But we have just one more MotorStorm game to talk about that saw a release on the PlayStation 3. But unlike the three prior MotorStorm games I talked about, MotorStorm RC also saw a release for the PlayStation Vita. In fact, that is where I first experienced this game. MotorStorm RC was a digital-only release and a spin-off of the mainline MotorStorm games, with it shifting to the top-down perspective and having us race around in RC cars. The game is fun and simple to enjoy with plenty of content, great visuals, and it should not be dismissed. It also has the honor of being the last time we would see the MotorStorm franchise, which still bums me out, and again, I don't know what's going on over at Sony. MotorStorm RC runs great using the native 1080p resolution option with the 17W performance mode preset on the Ally X, and I definitely recommend playing the game this way. Similar to the other MotorStorm games, we do need to make a few small changes to the default settings. Under GPU, we need to enable the write color buffers option, and under Advanced, the read color buffers option enabled. With those changes, this game runs incredibly well, and looks great, and runs fast and smooth. Odin Sphere is definitely not a stranger to the channel, as I featured it not only for the PlayStation 3, but also on the Vita and the original version on PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 3 version is a full-blown remake of the original PlayStation 2 game and goes beyond just updating the visuals for high-definition graphics. Odin Sphere is an incredible action RPG from Vanillaware, a studio that was featured once already in this video with Dragon's Crown. Odin Sphere has been a game that has consistently worked well with RPCS3 and on multitudes of devices, since it has a very low power requirement. On the Ally X, I have the game set to use the native 1080p resolution, with just a 13W silent mode preset on the Ally X, and performance is phenomenal, and honestly you could probably get away with a lower TDP custom preset for this game to really save on battery life. Additionally, this game does not require any changes from the default RPCS3 settings. Next up, here's something for fans of One Piece with Pirate Warriors 2, which is another Musou-style game from Omega Force that incorporates the well-known Dynasty Warriors gameplay with the world of One Piece. Pirate Warriors 2 as well as the original are both PlayStation exclusives that never saw a release on PC, and for this video I decided to feature Pirate Warriors 2, which came out on both PlayStation 3 and Vita. The sequels Pirate Warriors 3 and 4 would actually go on to see releases on PC. The game exhibited some interesting performance, and no matter what TDP preset I used, the game just would not stay at a 60 frames per second consistently. But despite that, the game always felt very fluid and fast, and so it doesn't seem to impact gameplay too much, and I'd say that it's very playable. For this footage, I have the Ally X set to use the 17W performance mode preset, and this game does not require any changes from the default RPCS3 configuration. PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale is another PlayStation exclusive that is essentially the PlayStation's version of Super Smash Bros., featuring characters from tons of Sony franchises, battling it out in a crossover fighting game. PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale was released for both the Vita and PlayStation 3 and remains exclusive to these platforms. It's really a shame that Sony never revisited this concept, as I think they could have established a new series with this game and built on the concepts established here. All-Stars Battle Royale was one of the first games included in Sony's cross-buy program, which provided a free copy of the game for Vita if you bought the PlayStation 3 version, in a move to help entice more support for the Vita. This is another game that, for whatever reason, gave me issues when I tried to upscale to 1080p, and so for this footage and for my testing, I am using the default 720p resolution with no changes to the default configuration for RPCS3, and using the 13W silent preset. The game runs very well with these settings. Puppeteer is a game that I've featured here before with RPCS3, and it's well worth talking about, since I feel like it's a game that many don't know about, and so to me it's a hidden gem that is worth playing. Puppeteer is a side-scrolling platformer that is a full-blown PlayStation exclusive, developed by Japan Studio, which eventually was reorganized into Team Asobi, the same studio behind Astrobot on PlayStation 5, just to give everyone an idea of how great this studio is, and really so many of their prior games are absolute must-plays. As the name suggests, you take control of a puppet named Kutaro, and the events play out like a puppet show as if the game is being presented in front of an audience. It's a very special game and one that comes highly recommended, and to this day is still stuck on the PlayStation 3. Puppeteer works great with RPCS3, and you can either go with the 13W silent mode preset at the default 720p resolution, or bump it up to a 150% resolution scale for 1080p, but the Ally X will need a 17W performance mode preset to help keep things nice and smooth. And it seems meant to be that the next game in this video is another from Japan Studio. Rain is another full-blown PlayStation 3 exclusive That, just like Puppeteer, is an absolutely a must-play, which was released as a digital title for the PlayStation Network. Rain is a beautiful adventure game that has a very interesting gameplay mechanic that revolves around the concept of invisibility. The main character is only visible when standing under rain, hence the title of the game. This same mechanic applies to the enemies, and so between the two, it makes for some very interesting gameplay moments. The game's music, story, and atmosphere all come together nicely to make this stand out among many of the games released on the PlayStation 3. Similar to Puppeteer, the game runs very well with RPCS3 and requires no changes from the default RPCS3 settings. You can either go with the native 720p resolution at 13 watts, but you might as well change the resolution scale to 150% for 1080p and run it at the same 13 watt preset with the Ally X. It's time to talk about Ratchet & Clank. We've got a whole bunch of these games. Ratchet & Clank was very well represented on the PlayStation 3, and all of these games are full-blown PlayStation 3 exclusives that have not been released anywhere else. Let's first talk about Ratchet & Clank Tools of Destruction, which is the first time that we would see Ratchet & Clank on the PlayStation 3 and the 5th main installment in the franchise. I remember this game being one of my most anticipated games early on for the PlayStation 3, and it definitely did not disappoint. For this game, we do need to change a few settings. Under CPU, the SPU block size needs to be set to Mega. Under GPU, we need to set the frame limit to 60, and the Z-call accuracy to approximate. I noticed that this game does switch between 30 and 60 frames per second in-game, which is normal behavior for it. Also, don't forget to turn off motion controls in the options in-game if you don't want to use that. Similar to when I featured this game last year, the game does very well with the performance mode preset, which on the Ally X is the 17 watt setting, and I recommend just sticking to the default 720p resolution for the best performance. Our next Ratchet & Clank game is Quest for Booty, which came after Tools of Destruction and is the 6th entry in the mainline games. This one was released on the PlayStation Network and actually never received a physical release in North America. This was a shorter than usual entry for the Ratchet & Clank franchise, which explains why it had only received a PSN release for North America. This is a direct sequel to Tools of Destruction and follows Ratchet in his quest to save Clank. For Quest for Booty, I recommend using a 30 frames per second frame limit since I found that regardless of the performance preset, this game can't stay locked to 60 frames per second consistently. The good news is that with a 30 frames per second frame limit, the game only needs the Ally X's 13 watt silent mode preset to stay smooth and stable with performance, which to me is pretty insane. For this game, we will need to make one additional change from the default RPCS3 setting. Under Advanced, you will want to set the RSX FIFO accuracy to Atomic, which helps improve stability. A Crack in Time is the next game that was released in the Ratchet & Clank franchise on the PlayStation 3 and is the 7th entry in the mainline games. Much like the other Ratchet & Clank games on the PS3, this one brings more Ratchet & Clank goodness and everything we expect, including awesome visuals, gameplay, and story. Similar to Quest for Booty, I recommend going with a 30 frames per second frame limit, but for this one you will want to bump up the Ally X's power to use the 17 watt performance mode preset, since this game is a bit more demanding and will require quite a bit of shader compilation. The frame limit definitely helps keep things nice and smooth. This game will also need a few changes from the default RPCS3 settings. Under GPU, enable the Write Color Buffers option, and under Advanced, enable the Read Color Buffers option, otherwise you will get some weird graphical glitches like black boxes around the flames. Amazingly, we are not done yet with the Ratchet & Clank franchise, and we have Into the Nexus, which is the 8th installment in the mainline Ratchet & Clank games, and the 4th and final installment in the Ratchet & Clank Future Saga, and continues much of the same from prior entries in the future entries of the series. This game is more demanding than the other entries, and I recommend playing this game with the Ally X's 25 watt turbo mode preset for the best performance possible. Like the other entries, we do need to make some changes to the default RPCS3 settings. Under Advanced, we need to enable the Read Color Buffer setting, which resolves the same graphical problem found in A Crack in Time. There are other graphical issues, but I would not consider them game-breaking and can be mostly ignored. Finally, we have Ratchet & Clank Full Frontal Assault, which is more of a departure from the mainline games and introduces tower defense elements for the first time in the franchise. For many Ratchet & Clank fans, this game is considered one of the worst in the franchise because of these gameplay changes, among other issues that it had. It's definitely interesting to talk about since it is so different, and it's worth noting that this game was also released on the PlayStation Vita. It's actually the most demanding of the Ratchet & Clank games that I've featured here, with it struggling to maintain 30 frames per second, even on the Ally X's 25W turbo mode preset. This game will require one change to the default settings. Under Advanced, enable the Read Color Buffer setting. For whatever reason, Rockstar Games to this day refuses to release Red Dead Redemption on PC. Thankfully, we have quite a few options to enjoy this game on PC. I talked about Red Dead Redemption last year in my Xenia Canary vs RPCS3 video, and I did find that performance was generally the best using the Xbox 360 version with Xenia Canary, which still holds true more than a year later. We also have the Switch version available to emulate, but in general I think that Xenia is the way to go for Red Dead Redemption. Regardless, let's talk about the PlayStation 3 version briefly, and see how things are with the current builds of RPCS3. For this game, I am using the vanilla version of Red Dead Redemption, which does have slightly better performance than the more updated versions like the one found in the Game of the Year edition. I recommend that you keep this game as vanilla as possible, since performance will be worse in later updates. This game does require quite a few changes from the default RPCS3 settings. Under CPU, we need to set the SPU block size to Mega. Under GPU, it is best to disable anti-aliasing, which will improve performance, set the Z-call accuracy to relaxed, and enable the Right Color Buffers option. Finally, under Advanced, you will want to set the Sleep Timer's accuracy to as host, and the RSX FIFO accuracy to atomic. With the Ally X, I am set to use the 25W turbo mode preset, and despite this, the game is still not at full speed, and performance is very variable, with it running smooth at times, and then depending on the scene, much worse. We're still not quite there with Red Dead Redemption, at least with RPCS3 on these handheld devices. Insomniac Games was very busy on the PlayStation 3, and we saw the introduction of a brand new franchise from them with Resistance Fall of Man, which became a PlayStation 3 staple from the moment the console launched, as it was the launch game to own for the console. So let's talk about all of the Resistance games on PlayStation 3, which are all full-blown exclusives to the console to this day. The first Resistance game is easily the best performing, which isn't too surprising, and best of all, it doesn't require any changes from the default RPCS3 settings. The game runs very well with RPCS3, and you can either go with the default 720p using just the 13W preset, or make use of a 150% upscale for 1080p, which will need a bit more power using the 17W performance mode preset on the Ally X. Regardless, the first entry in the Resistance franchise performs very well here. So let's now talk about Resistance 2, which takes the franchise into a whole new level. And it shows, because this game's requirements is definitely quite the jump from the first game, and ends up being far more demanding. For Resistance 2, it's probably going to be best just to stick to the default 720p resolution, and we will need to up the TDP and use the 17W performance mode preset to keep things smoother, and honestly, depending on the gameplay sequence, you might even need to go a bit above that. For this game, you will need to make one change from the default RPCS3 configuration, and under GPU you will want to change the Z-call accuracy to relaxed. Finally, let's talk about the third Resistance, which is also the last one released on the PlayStation 3, and the last one that would be developed by Insomniac Games. Similar to the second game, Resistance 3 will require a bit more power to keep things nice and smooth. For this one, I went with the 17W performance preset, which does a decent job keeping things playable, with some dips here and there, especially with the shader compilation, using the default 720p resolution. One thing that is important to note with Resistance 3 is that the aim down sights makes the frame rate crawl most of the time, which is a bummer because outside of that issue, the game is playable. For this game, we do need to make one change from the default RPCS3 setting, and similar to Resistance 2, we will need to change the Z-call accuracy to relaxed under GPU. Resurrección is easily one of my favorite PlayStation Network experiences that released on the PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, and PlayStation Vita, which makes it a PlayStation exclusive game. It was developed by Housemarque, the same studio responsible for the more recent Returnal on PlayStation 5 and PC. This studio is no stranger to the shoot-'em-up style gameplay, and Resurrección, especially with upscaling, is just an absolute treat, and with RPCS3, one of the best ways to experience this great game. For Resurrección, I am set to the 13W silent preset using a 150% resolution upscale for 1080p, and the game has no issues running incredibly well and smooth, and I've got to say that it's just absolutely glorious looking upscale. And wouldn't you believe it, we've got another PlayStation exclusive, and this time a full-blown PlayStation 3 exclusive with Ridge Racer 7 which continued the tradition of PlayStation consoles launching with a Ridge Racer game. The game isn't as exclusive as one might think, since Ridge Racer 7 is essentially a reworked version of Ridge Racer 6, which was released exclusively for the Xbox 360. Now personally, I love this era of the Ridge Racer franchise, which has gameplay similar to the PlayStation Portable version, and these games are just so much fun to play and have been personal favorites of mine for a long time. Ridge Racer 7 is an excellent performer with RPCS3, and this game supports 1080p natively and just looks gorgeous at that resolution, especially since it's a full 60 frames per second. The best part is that this game is running this way with just the 13-watt silent preset with the Ally X and doesn't require any changes from the default settings. Shadows of the Damned makes a return from last year's Xenia Canary vs RPCS3 showcase, and it's always exciting to be able to feature Shadows of the Damned, which I feel like is an overlooked game from Grasshopper Manufacture, the same studio responsible for No More Heroes, and comes to us from the mind of Suda51, with production handled by Shinji Mikami, best known for his work with the Resident Evil franchise. Like many other Grasshopper Manufacture games, this one is definitely an over-the-top experience that is a ton of fun from start to finish. I do have good news though, since we are getting a remastered version of this game coming out for Halloween, and so this once console exclusive will finally make its way to a bunch of platforms, including PC. For this game, you can either go with a 13-watt silent preset at the default 720p resolution, or bump things up and use a 150% resolution scale for 1080p, but you will need to bump up to the Ally X's 17-watt performance preset for 1080p. If you do opt to do upscaling, you will need to change one setting. Under GPU, you need to change the resolution scale threshold to 512 by 512, otherwise you will have issues with the resolution scaling. And we've got another console exclusive returning from last year's Versus video. Silent Hill Downpour is an interesting entry in the Silent Hill franchise, and one that I think has developed into a fan favorite. Downpour was developed by Vatra Games, and it was the only Silent Hill game developed by them since the studio is no longer around. Personally, I think Downpour is a pretty awesome entry in the franchise that does a lot right, capturing the essence of what makes Silent Hill games great with its atmosphere, story, and exploration. Silent Hill Downpour continues to be a great performer with RPCS3, and this time around I went ahead and used the native 1080p resolution, and with the Ally X's 13-watt silent preset, the game runs quite well, requiring no changes from the default RPCS3 configuration. Skate 3 is yet another game returning from last year's Versus video, and Skate 3 has been a long-time triumph of RPCS3 being a great benchmark for performance with the emulator, and I definitely remember the excitement around RPCS3 being able to emulate this game properly. Skate 3 is a fantastic skateboarding game from Electronic Arts that remains a console exclusive to the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. And nearly 14 years later, we still don't have a proper sequel or a new entry in the Skate franchise. So this game and all the prior entries remains highlights as games to emulate with RPCS3. Given the excitement around emulating these Skate games, it's not much of a surprise that they run incredibly well with RPCS3, and for this game you will only need to make one change to the default RPCS3 configuration. Under GPU, you will want to enable the right color buffers option. The game has native 1080p support, which is what I'm testing for this footage, using the Ally X's 17-watt performance preset, which helps keep things nice and smooth, especially with shader compilation. You can easily get away with the 13-watt silent preset if you're just running at default 720p resolution. Sly Cooper Thieves of Time is making a return to the channel, and sadly Thieves of Time would be the last time we would get a Sly Cooper game. It's yet another PlayStation exclusive franchise that has been all but forgotten nowadays. Thieves of Time was released for both the PlayStation Vita and PlayStation 3 and was not developed by Sucker Punch. Instead, Sanzaru Games took over development duties, and I think they did an excellent job with this entry in the franchise, which was the fourth and final game. Thieves of Time is a fairly demanding game, but I thought it would be a nice opportunity to see if we could enjoy some upscaling with this one. For the footage, I am set to use a 150% resolution upscale to get that nice 1080p resolution. And I have the Ally X set to 25-watt turbo mode preset to keep things nice and smooth as possible, since this game does target 60 frames per second. The game's art style and graphics really look great at this resolution. If you're wanting to save on power consumption, the game does run well at its default 720p resolution using the 17-watt performance preset with the Ally X. For this game, you will need to make a few changes from the default RPCS3 configuration. Under GPU, you will need to set the frame limit to 60 and enable multi-threaded RSX. Under Advanced, change the RSX FIFO accuracy to Atomic. One last note, this game does have motion control sequences that are required for gameplay, so you will need to set up motion controls for this game. The Soul Calibur franchise continued during the 7th generation of consoles and saw 2 new entries in the mainline series with Soul Calibur 4 and 5. Both of these Soul Calibur games are console exclusive that released only on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Let's start with Soul Calibur 4, which I believe I haven't featured yet on the channel, and so it's certainly worth talking about. Unlike some prior entries in the franchise, Soul Calibur 4 did not have an arcade release prior to the home console versions, and it's also the first time that the franchise included online play. Soul Calibur 4 continued the tradition of console-exclusive playable characters with the PS3 version including Darth Vader, and the Xbox 360 version including Yoda. Soul Calibur 4 does very well with RPCS3. You can either go with the native 720p resolution using the 13W silent preset with the Ally X, or make use of the 150% resolution upscale for 1080p using the 17W performance preset, and the performance is excellent. For this game, there are a few changes that need to be made from the default RPCS3 settings. Under GPU, make sure to set the frame limit to use the PS3 native, since you will get some crackling sounds, which I did confirm and I experienced on the Ally X. Additionally, you will want to enable the right color buffers option. Now let's now talk about Soul Calibur 5, and this is the last game in the original Souls series timeline. Soul Calibur 5 continues the tradition of guest characters, with Ezio Auditore from the Assassin's Creed franchise making an appearance for this go-around. Interestingly, the story mode for this game was actually outsourced to CyberConnect 2, the same developers responsible for Asura's Wrath, a game and studio that we talked about earlier in this video. Soul Calibur 5 is very demanding, especially when compared to Soul Calibur 4. The game still isn't quite smooth at 17 watts using the default 720p resolution. Now, I prefer the upscaling with this game since it looks so good, but even at 25 watts the game is still not full speed at all times, but it does get very close, so really it's just a matter of preference. For this game, we will need to make a few changes. Under GPU, enable the right color buffers option, and adjust the resolution scale threshold to 512 by 512 only if you have plans on upscaling the game. Under Advanced, enable the Read Depth Colors, Write Depth Colors, and Read Color Buffers options. It's time for Spider-Man to make an appearance here, and I chose Spider-Man Edge of Time because it's one of the few games that never received a PC version, despite the game that came prior to it, Shattered Dimensions, being on PC. This is the second Spider-Man game developed by Beanox, and I'm a pretty big fan of this game despite the lackluster reviews. I think the story is a lot of fun with the time-traveling elements. Oddly enough, I first played it on the Nintendo 3DS and then went back and played the home console versions. Edge of Time is a game that works very well with RPCS3, and I tested both the default 720p resolution as well as the 1080p resolution using the 150% upscale. For the default resolution, the game does well with just the 13W silent preset, and for 1080p you will want to bump it up a little bit and use the 17W performance preset with the Ally X. This game doesn't require any changes from the default RPCS3 settings, and is an awesome experience with RPCS3. The 7th generation definitely saw the return of some franchises, and unexpectedly, Splatterhouse was one of those games returning after almost 20 years. Splatterhouse is a console exclusive that released only on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, and is considered a reboot and reimagining of the original Splatterhouse game. This game is a beat-em-up hack-and-slash with tons of gore, and surprisingly received very mixed reviews. But I think it's still worth checking out for beat-em-up fans, and it's a good one to play for Halloween. Splatterhouse runs very well with RPCS3 and doesn't require any changes from the default RPCS3 settings. I tested the default 720p resolution, and it runs very well with just the 13W silent mode preset, or you can make use of upscaling at 150% for 1080p, and for this you will want to go with the 17W performance mode preset on the Ally X. We're not quite done yet with Housemarque, who I featured earlier with Resogun, and this studio put out a lot of great PlayStation Network titles, including Super Stardust HD, which is a multi-directional shooter much like Geometry Wars and a PlayStation exclusive that saw versions over the years for the PlayStation 4, PlayStation Portable, and Vita. The PlayStation 3 version was the first of the modern take on the Super Stardust franchise and is a blast to play, no pun intended. In fact, it made IGN's top 25 PlayStation Network games, coming in at the 4th spot. Super Stardust HD lends itself very well to a handheld device as it's the perfect pick up and play type of game, and best of all, it doesn't require a whole lot of power to run using the native 1080p resolution at just the 13W solid preset with the Ally X, and requires no changes to the default configuration. Now we're not quite done yet with the fighting games, and Tekken is certainly one of the most inseparable from the PlayStation brand when talking about this genre. Tekken Tag Tournament 2 is the sequel to the original Tekken Tag game, as well as the 8th installment in the Tekken franchise. Tekken Tag Tournament 2 is a console exclusive that released for both the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, as well as the Wii U as a launch game for that console. It's another great entry in the Tekken franchise. This game performs incredibly well with RPCS3, requiring only one change from the default configuration. Under GPU, make sure to enable the right color buffer setting. I do recommend going with the default 720p resolution for this one, since there were more graphical glitches using the 150% resolution scale for 1080p. But performance-wise, both resolutions ran great with just the 13W silent preset for the Ally X. In fact, I'm pretty sure you can set a custom TDP for this one and really sip on that battery. And we're not quite done yet with Tekken, and here we have Tekken 6, which is actually the 7th game in the Tekken franchise, and this did release before Tekken Tag Tournament 2. So it is the older game, but similar to Tekken Tag Tournament, it is a console exclusive. Tekken 6 was released for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and it actually had a pretty awesome port to the PlayStation Portable, and is also part of the PlayStation Plus Classics lineup, so it is available to play on the PlayStation 4 and 5. For those that want to enjoy this on PC, the home console versions will be the way to go if you're looking for the best graphical fidelity. And thankfully, Tekken 6 works quite well with RPCS3, and doesn't require any changes from the default configuration. Similar to Tekken Tag Tournament 2, this game does very well with the 13W silent preset on the Ally X, and you can choose to go with the default 720p resolution, or make use of the 150% resolution upscaling for 1080p. I don't know if it's just me, but I love tennis games, and for me, I think it all began with Virtua Tennis on the Sega Dreamcast, which forever cemented my love of tennis games. Topspin 3 and 4 continue the Topspin franchise that began in the generation prior, and I've always enjoyed the Topspin franchise, with both Topspin 3 and 4 being console exclusives that never saw a release on PC. The Topspin franchise would not make a return until just this year with the release of Topspin 2K25. So let's talk Topspin 3 first, which runs very well with RPCS3 and doesn't require any changes from the default configuration. For Topspin 3, you can enjoy the 150% resolution upscaling for 1080p using just the 13W silent preset with the Ally X, which means that the default 720p resolution will have no trouble going with a custom TDP that uses less power. Topspin 4, on the other hand, doesn't fare as well as Topspin 3 and does require one change from the default configuration. Under Advanced, you will need to enable the read color buffer setting, which will fix issues with some of the textures. Unfortunately, Topspin 4 does suffer from some graphical issues in general, regardless of the resolution, but in-game gameplay is mostly unaffected. It's slightly more demanding than Topspin 3, and for the 150% upscale for 1080p, you will need to go with the 17W performance mode preset to keep things nice and smooth, or 13W for the default 720p resolution. The graphical issues can be resolved by switching over to OpenGL, but performance really suffers with that backend, and so it's best to continue using Vulkan and then dealing with the graphical issues. Twisted Metal is another full-blown PlayStation 3 exclusive and the most recent entry in the franchise, which to this day has not been revisited by Sony on more recent PlayStation consoles, which honestly really surprises me. This entry is considered the second reboot of the Twisted Metal series and was developed by Eat Sleep Play, with David Jaffe returning as director for this game. This game is very demanding for these handheld devices, and despite spending a lot of time trying to get the best settings for this game, I found that no matter what, we can't quite get it to a full 30 frames per second. The target frame rate is just difficult to achieve even with the 25W turbo mode with the Ally X. We are probably a generation or two out before we will see this game be full speed on these handheld x86 devices. For this one, just leave the settings at default, since I found that tweaking the settings resulted in minor games with this game. I do recommend making use of the universal game patches, and so under all game patches, make sure to enable the disable MLAA option for Twisted Metal, but in general, this is the best we're going to get at this time. We're getting pretty close to the end here, and it's almost impossible to not talk about PlayStation 3 without mentioning the Uncharted franchise, which was the console's first real must-own title and kicked off a massive franchise that would have multiple sequels and even have a full-blown movie based on it. Uncharted 1 was an incredibly impressive game for the time, and it really showed off the capabilities of the PlayStation 3, as well as continuing Naughty Dog's legacy of producing high-quality exclusives. All three of the Uncharted games released on the PlayStation 3 were technical marvels, and easily some of the hardest to emulate here with RPCS3, so it's best to stick with the default 720p resolution for all three games. For Uncharted 1, I am using the 25W turbo mode preset with the Ally X to help keep things as smooth as possible. The game isn't perfect with RPCS3 and does have some glitches with textures when the camera gets close, but other than that, it's mostly solid. Despite the 25W setting, the game does dip under its target of 30 frames per second. For Uncharted 1, we will need to make a few changes from the default settings. Under GPU, enable the right color buffer setting, and under Advanced, enable the right depth buffer setting, and change the RSX FIFO accuracy to atomic. In addition, you will want to make use of the game patches that are available to improve performance as much as possible, including disabling depth of field and motion blur, as well as the bug fix for slow initialization times. And as wonderful as Uncharted was, Uncharted 2 Among Thieves took everything to the next level, and it might be my favorite game in the entire series. Uncharted 2 is about as close as it can get to a perfect game, and it is impressive in almost every aspect. This game is very demanding with RPCS3, and honestly for the x86 handhelds, it still remains a benchmark game since it requires quite a bit to keep the frame rate stable, which unfortunately isn't the case here with the Ally X, even with the 25W turbo mode preset. The game still dips under 30 frames per second quite frequently, despite all the adjustments to the settings. And speaking of these settings, the game will need a few changes. Under GPU, you will want to enable the right color buffers, multi-threaded RSX, and asynchronous texture streaming options. Under Advanced, enable both RSX reservation access as well as red depth buffers, and set the RSX FIFO accuracy to atomic. Similar to the first game, we will want to utilize the patches available here, disabling as many of these special effects to improve performance. Finally, let's talk about the third game in the franchise with Uncharted 3, Drake's Deception, and just like the other entries, it is quite demanding of the Ally X, and another benchmark game for PlayStation 3 emulation with RPCS3. For this game, I recommend updating it to version 1.10, so that you can make use of the available game patches and enable all of the disable options like Bloom, Depth of Field, MLAA, as well as the performance patch when enabling the right color buffers option. This game has a ton of shader compilation, so just be patient with it as it will smooth out quite a bit afterwards. For this game, like the others, we wanted to change a few settings. Under GPU, set the Z-code accuracy to relaxed, and enable the right color buffers, multi-threaded RSX, and asynchronous texture streaming options. Under Advanced, enable the accurate RSX reservation access and the red color buffers, as well as change RSX FIFO accuracy to atomic. We've got one last fighting game here to talk about before we wrap this video up, and Virtua Fighter probably doesn't need much of an introduction, being the oldest of the 3D fighting game franchises featured here. Virtua Fighter 5 is the 5th entry in the long-running franchise and is a console exclusive with versions released for the Xbox 360, as well as the PlayStation 3 and 4. Virtua Fighter 5 works very well with RPCS3, requiring no changes from the default settings. For this footage, I am set to use the native 1080p resolution, using the 13W silent preset with the Ally X, and gameplay is very smooth. You can easily get away with a lower TDP if you leave the resolution at the 720p default. Wipeout HD Fury is one of my absolute favorite PlayStation 3 games and just one of my favorite franchises in general. I love the fast-paced futuristic racing that the series brings to the table with its gorgeous visuals, and for me it has always been a great showcase for emulation, regardless if we're talking about PlayStation 3, Vita, or even the PlayStation Portable versions. Wipeout HD and the Fury expansion pack are PlayStation exclusives that saw a remaster for the PlayStation 4 with the Omega Collection. But for those that want to experience some Wipeout HD action on the PC, the PlayStation 3 version runs very well with RPCS3. The game supports 1080p natively, and at 13 watts with the Ally X, the game runs beautifully at the 1080p resolution, especially once the initial shader compilation has completed. For this game, we do need to make a few changes from the default RPCS3 configuration. Under GPU, make sure to enable the right color buffer setting, and under Advanced, set the RSX FIFO accuracy to atomic. The Witch and the 100 Knight returns from last year's video and is a great PlayStation exclusive title from Nippon Ichi Software, also known as NIS, and is an action role-playing game with fantastic visuals and a great story and cast of characters. This is another game that I had some weird issues with upscaling to 1080p, so I definitely recommend leaving it at the default 720p resolution, but with the Ally X's 13-watt silent preset, the game works very well, and it's definitely not one to miss for RPG fans since it's a pretty unique game. And we have finally made it to number 100. Yakuza Dead Souls is an awesome entry and spin-off in the Yakuza franchise that many probably don't know exists, and it is a full-blown exclusive to the PlayStation 3 and has not been re-released anywhere else, which is why I'm featuring it in this video. Personally, I love this game, and really, how can you go wrong? We've got the world of Yakuza mixed in with a zombie apocalypse, and surprisingly, it makes for a pretty fun result. I'd love to see Sega revisit this one and perhaps build or improve on some of the weaknesses with the gameplay, but for now this is all we've got, and RPCS3 is the only way to enjoy it outside of the PlayStation 3. Yakuza Dead Souls definitely gave me some issues locking up at certain segments. Now the settings that follow seem to be the most stable for me, but no guarantees as to how it will perform across the entirety of the game, so it's definitely something to keep in mind. Using the 17-watt performance preset with the Ally X, the game does a decent job staying at its target frame rate, with very rare occasional dips because of shader compilation. Otherwise, performance is pretty solid using the default 720p resolution. So for this game, we're going to need to change a few settings. Under CPU, change the SPU decoder to ASMJIT, and the SPU block size to Mega. Under GPU, change the Z-code accuracy to approximate, and enable strict rendering mode. Under Advanced, change the driver wake-up delay to 200, which is what I recommend to start with. And that does it for this absolutely doozy of a video that is now the channel's longest to date. I really do hope that this video, just like last year's, will be helpful to many, and I hope it opens the doors to more enjoying PlayStation 3 emulation on their Ally X or their handheld of choice. One thing's for sure, this will not be the last time we talk about PlayStation 3 emulation on the channel, and I look forward to revisiting the topic again in the future. As always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.